Good afternoon and welcome to the Center for Human Rights and International Justice annual lecture on human rights. My name is Kyoteru Tsutsui and I'm a co-director of the center along with Professor David Cohen. This year, 2024, marks the center's 10th anniversary. Our annual lecture is always special, but this year is particularly special. And for this occasion, I am really pleased to welcome my friend and esteemed international human rights lawyer, Jared Genser. Before getting to introduce him, I need to thank our event co-sponsor, Stanford Immigration and Human Rights Law Association, and also our generous sponsor. We benefited from his donation, Mr. John Raff. Okay. Now, let me introduce Jared Genser. As I said, he's an esteemed international human rights lawyer for over 20 years. He served as managing director of Persos Strategies, a public interest law firm, and as special advisor on the responsibility to protect to the Organization of American States, while at the same time also acting as outside general counsel to the Neurotechnologies Foundation, the most relevant unit for his talk today. Referred to as the extractor by the New York Times for his global efforts in extracting political prisoners, Jared has provided pro bono counsel to a number of Nobel Peace Prize laureates, at least 5 that I know of, including Aung San Suu Kyi, Liu Xiaobo, and Alice Bialatsky most recently. His career spans partnerships at DLA Piper LLP, management consulting with McKinsey and Company, and teaching positions at Georgetown Law Center, University of Pennsylvania Law School, and University of Michigan Law School. He has held prestigious fellowships at Harvard University's Carr Center for Human Rights Policy and the National Endowment for Democracy. And he was named one of 40 under 40 Washington's Rising Stars by the National Law Journal. Jared is the founder of Freedom Now. You may have heard of that NGO dedicated to freeing prisoners of conscience worldwide. And he holds degrees from Cornell University, Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, and the University of Michigan Law School. An accomplished author and editor, Jared has received numerous awards, including the American Bar Association's International Human Rights Award and the Tolberg Eliasson Global Leadership Prize. And he's actively engaged in various professional associations. And we're privileged to host him here. Hear him talk about his most recent project, The Next Frontier is Your Mind, Neurotechnologies, Human Rights, and the Battle for Your Brain. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Jared Genser.
Well, thank you so much, Kyo, Professor Tsutsui. I also would like to begin by thanking the sponsors of the event, the Center for Human Rights and International Justice, the Stanford Immigration and Human Rights Law Association, and the financial sponsors for the event as well. I'm excited to be here out at Stanford. I always wonder how you get any work done out here with the beautiful weather outside, but I'm glad to see a few people here today to hear me talk about a topic that I've really only been involved in for 3+ years now, but is going to transform our world. And in ways that you're going to learn very quickly through a series of slides and issues that I'll discuss, in ways that will really be transformative even for what it means to be human in the 21st century. And so my talk today is really focusing on how do we promote innovation in neurotechnologies while also protecting human rights and ensuring its ethical development. For anyone who wants the slides at the end, I'm more than happy to share them with you so that you don't have to document along the way. And you'll see that the overall approach is I'm going to talk about what are neurotechnologies, why are they advancing so quickly, what are neuro rights and why are they needed, why is this a problem for today rather than a future problem, and then how might appropriate legal and regulatory frameworks be developed at the UN, at the national level and with companies, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions as well. So let me begin by defining some basic terms so we're all on the same page of what we're talking about. So neurotechnologies are devices that can record or alter the activity of the brain in the wider nervous system. That's the definition of neurotechnologies. Central to neurotechnologies are what are called brain-computer interfaces or brain-machine interfaces. And these are devices that connect the brain to a computer or other machine and can facilitate bidirectional communication, either by exporting neural data or even by altering brain activity. Neural data is information generated by the measurement or activity of a person's central or peripheral nervous system. How is this done? There are direct methods, for example, an EEG, an electroencephalogram, and indirect methods as well. And there are a wide array of ways in which neurotechnologies can capture the activity of the brain. And there are two kinds of neurotechnologies. There are those that are invasive, which require neurosurgery to implant a device inside of the human skull, either on the surface or inside the brain itself. And then there are non-invasive or wearable neurotechnologies, which are caps, hats, helmets, or wristbands, among other things, and we'll talk about both of those. So let's begin by talking about what are invasive neurotechnologies, and even the developments here might be well beyond what you might have imagined just hearing about the topic and deciding to show up today. Now, some of these you may vaguely have heard of. There's deep brain stimulation. These have been around for now several decades, and they can, for example, reduce the effects of Parkinson's disease and tremors that people have. And then there are cochlear implants, which you, again, probably have heard of as well, that relate to connecting sound coming to a person from outside of their body and then putting that into the auditory nerve so that a person who was unable to hear is able to hear. But there are also even more extraordinary developments that are happening right now and are already coming. This is an example from just last summer in the New York Times, and it's the story of a woman who previously was unable to communicate for 18 years. She was paralyzed and nonverbal, and with an implantable brain-computer interface, she's now able to communicate at about 70 words a minute, thought-to-text translation, and on top of that, even though her face is substantially paralyzed, avatar that was set up for her that is speaking on a screen now can actually also decode the intended muscle movements of her face and capture her emotions from her facial muscles as well. And actually, I think we have let me see if this video here is going to work. Let's see. Oops, guess not. Okay, well, I had a video showing it, but nonetheless, it's not a problem. You can find this online as well. But as you can imagine, she was literally locked into her own body for 18 years, and now, because of this invasive neurotechnology placed on the surface of her brain to be able to communicate and convey emotions and to be unlocked after all this time, you can only begin to imagine the medical implications of this for all different people. And it's worth noting that 1 in 3 people in the world will at one point have some kind of neurological disease. This is another example of invasive neurotechnologies. Scientists analyzed the brain activity recorded by electrodes that were already in the brains of people with epilepsy, but they repurposed it for another purpose, and they were able to actually analyze the brain activity of a person who was listening to Pink Floyd's Another Brick in the Wall, and from the brain activity itself, decode that and then play it back out loud. And if you listen to that online, you'll also see that you can almost recognize it on its own if you know the song. And it's kind of extraordinary that that is what's being decoded from the brain activity itself. And to be able to do that is quite extraordinary. Now let's talk about wearable neurotechnologies, which again are also probably further along than you might imagine. This was actually for a number of years ago. Someone who was paraplegic in a robotic suit kicked off the World Cup using a robotic exoskeleton controlled by their mind using a wearable cap. You can also see how a person who's quadriplegic and used to be an IndyCar driver can now actually race cars again, despite being paralyzed, again, using a wearable brain-computer interface. And you can even decode what a person thinks with a wearable device from images that are in their head. And so what they did in this particular experiment is they put a person in a lab and showed them a series of photographs that were going to be in this video. and then took a snapshot with an fMRI scan to see how their brain was firing when they saw that image in their visual cortex. And then when the person is watching the video later, those images can be decoded from the prior signals that were there when they saw those images in photographs. And you can see on the left, these words fade in and out in terms of significance, but these are the words that they're thinking when they are watching these videos. So today there are actually about 30 consumer neurotechnology products that are actually already publicly available and on the market, and we're talking about non-invasive wearable devices. And these are just a couple of examples of these devices that you can take a look at. There's a helmet that promotes brain health and monitors sleep and trying to improve sleep. Another headset that purports to treat symptoms of depression. Neurosky, for example, has a helicopter drone that you can actually fly using your thoughts. You train it to know when you're thinking of different directions you want it to go, and then the helicopter will fly in the direction that you're thinking. I've actually used this device before. It's actually pretty cool. On the surface of it, as I'll explain, there are some concerns about the data more broadly being gathered. But these are examples of devices that are already available right now today on the market. And so I was just mentioning this particular device, which is the Neurosky flying helicopter drone. So why are Neurotechnologies developing so quickly, and what is important about that? First of all, there's been a massive investment in the development of neurotechnologies. It began in 2013 with President Obama's Brain Initiative. In addition, you can see here that China is investing $8 billion through 2030. This is all through the Chinese military. To be fair to the Chinese, part of the US investment in neurotechnologies is also going through our military, through DARPA. Other money is being invested in the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. You can see that there's been more than $33 billion already invested into neurotech companies. And while the growth of BCIs is expected to reach $4 billion annually by 2027, we are about to see, as I'll explain, that this number dramatically understates the potential for the advances of these products in light of the fact that major tech companies are now all developing their own consumer neurotech products. And once they become available, that growth is going to go exponential and global very quickly. Another thing that we're seeing happen, which matters enormously for what these devices can do, is the development of much more sophisticated and advanced BCIs and BMIs. For example, the Kernel Flow helmet, which is now about 2 or 3 years old, is the equivalent of putting an MRI machine, which is like a $500,000 to $1 million machine, into a wearable helmet to be able to decode brain activity. And when, right now those devices are really only being marketed B2B, business to business, but are empowering a range of developments of software applications that are going to have an enormous impact as well. Ultimately, when that kind of kernel flow device can be made more inexpensive from competition and the development of competitive devices, to be able to have that as a wearable device is going to be both incredibly exciting in terms of what could be done with it, but also very worrying in terms of how that kind of technology can be misused or abused. And then the last thing that is accelerating the development of neurotechnologies is generative artificial intelligence, which is enabling the processing of these brain scans, which, as I'll talk a little bit more in a moment, these wearable devices are primarily all medical grade brain-computer interfaces, like EEG scanners. Almost all of them are EEG scanners. And they're generating the equivalent of from gigabytes to terabytes of data from users individually. And then to be able to use generative AI to do that in mass and to process that volume of data is creating enormous advances. One of the most extraordinary recent developments, which comes off of what's already been able to be done with invasive devices, is in December, as you'll see from last year, a group of researchers in Australia combining both EEG scanners, which are already available on the market, as I said, as consumer devices, combined with generative AI, can already convert thought to text with 40 to 60% accuracy. Now, that's not enough to go to market with, obviously, but what I will tell you here and now is within the next 2 years or so, you will see on the front page of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal what will be, in my view, what ChatGPT was for the generative AI technologies for the world of neurotechnologies. Because once you can get a wearable device that can decode thought to text at 90% plus accuracy, all of a sudden people are going to understand very quickly and immediately both how exciting and how worrying neurotechnologies are for our future. So let's talk about neurorights and why they're actually needed. So what you can see here on the screen is the picture of a person who got me into all of this work, a guy named Rafael Yuste. He's an MD, PhD at Columbia, runs the neurotech lab there as well. And it was from a single conversation I had with him about 3.5 years ago that made me realize that my view of the world and where we are heading in terms of both advancing human rights, but also needing to protect our human rights, missed an enormous set of developments that we were on the cusp of seeing in the world of neurotechnologies. And he, I would describe as very much of a modern-day Oppenheimer, in the sense that he is one of the world's leading experts on the technology, probably one of the 10 most published people in the field. And about a dozen years ago, he conducted an experiment in his lab at Columbia, which scared the heck out of him in terms of what he was able to do, and it immediately made him realize that he had to do something much more to try to talk about the human rights implications of the technology. And the experiment went as follows. You can see on the left a little mouse there, and the mouse is actually looking at the left of that picture at a screen that shows a series of black bars moving from left to right across the screen. And he trained a mouse to, when it saw those black bars, right in front of it you see a little dot at the end of a little pole, and that actually disperses a sugar syrup. When the mouse licks the sugar syrup, then more sugar syrup appears. And the mouse was taught that when it saw the bars moving across the screen that it should lick, and when the screen was turned off, it should stop licking. Using an fMRI, functional magnetic imagery, into the mouse's brain, you can see on the right a photograph of the visual cortex of the mouse, and each of those individual dots that you see lit up are actually individual neurons. Unlike in the human brain, which is, of course, much larger and has many more neurons than a mouse's brain, you can't get down to see the level of firing neurons except in very limited ways. But in the case of a mouse, it's about 500 neurons that are firing when it sees this image on the screen. And then, of course, when you turn off the screen, the visual cortex looks different as well. But with then an implantable brain-computer interface into the mouse, into the brain, into the visual cortex, you can actually play the mouse's neurons like a piano and replicate the firing of those 500 neurons in exactly the same way that, that they were firing when the mouse saw that image on the screen. And when you do that, you probably will not be surprised to learn that you can project a hallucination into the mouse of the brain, and the mouse will start to lick the sugar syrup as if it was seeing the images on the screen, except that there are no images on the screen. So this is, I guess, the equivalent of the Matrix for the mouse in some narrow way. So this was both exciting and scary, and many years later, in fact, you can do much more with a mouse. You can actually play a mouse like a marionette. You can even, there are experiments that have been done that have basically wired up a mouse's brain where you can have the mouse move with a joystick and step where you want it to step based on firing neurons in its brain to give it those instructions. And what can be done in a mouse can be done in a chimpanzee and later in a human, not very quickly to be clear, but ultimately eventually, because the science obviously is the same. And so this led Rafa, my colleague, to get together a group of 24 other experts to develop what are referred to really as a set of neuro rights. And these were all experts on the science and the tech, not experts on the law. But what they did is they got together and said, based on everything that they knew, what are the concerns they see going forward in terms of the potential misuse and abuse of this technology? And what are areas of concern that we should be trying to address? When they then published in the journal Nature this peer-reviewed article. Ultimately, we've now expanded the number of neuro rights to 5, but let me just kind of describe to you what we're talking about here. And to be clear, we're not talking about necessarily new human rights or needing to develop a new set of human rights, but really to the further interpretation of existing rights to protect against the misuse and abuse of these technologies. So the 5 rights we're talking about are mental privacy, the idea that you need to be able to control the contents of your own brain and your own neural pathways, a right of personal identity, the right to be able to control who you are and to not have anything imposed upon you, a right of free will to be able to make your own decisions without external influence from neurotechnologies, a right to be free from bias and how these technologies are developed and how they're applied, and then lastly, and ultimately, a right of fair access to mental augmentation. This last one undoubtedly will be the slowest set of technologies to advance. Much like when you think about communication in a foreign language, the ability to decode and to translate a language for a person is much quicker to develop than their ability to speak it, or their ability to be able to write it. And it's a very similar kind of set of challenges one has when you're talking about decoding neurotechnologies and ultimately changing the activities of the brain rather than just simply decoding what they're actually doing. But it's worth noting, for example, when you talk about mental augmentation, that there was a study done late last year published at Boston University of a number of senior citizens, and based on the application of an external brain-computer interface that was providing electrical stimulation to the parts of the brain that deal with memory, they actually published a study showing the ability to improve by 30% the short-term memory of senior citizens in their ability to memorize a list of 20 items over a multiple day period of time. And you can only imagine that once that kind of a technology might be more widely available, and imagine you're sitting here at Stanford in a lecture and you're a student, and you come here with lots of resources from your family, or you are here on a lot of financial aid. Imagine if some people are able to afford a device that at home at night they're able to stimulate their memory, and then you're having to take an exam sitting next to a person who had that device, but you couldn't afford to have that device. And what kind of implications is that going to have for the gap between have and have-nots? So people are always asking me, what are nightmare scenarios for neurotechnologies? I've talked about the 5 neurorights and the 5 areas of concern, and they map out quite well to the kinds of risks that you might have. This, of course, I hope most of you have seen The Matrix, a pretty classic movie. Little did one realize at the time how science imitates, or art imitates science or imitates life. But there are nightmare scenarios for neurotechnologies that are really both near and longer term. But let me begin by a number of the near-term scenarios. As discussed before, mind reading technology is really already here. Thought-to-text translation with implantable devices. But even the device I was talking about in Australia, which is not yet at a level of, let's say, 90% plus accuracy, it will be there within probably 2 or 3 years, and it will then be much more widely available. The reality is the device in Australia does not require a person's cooperation to decode thought. As long as the person is thinking in the form of words, the text can be decoded the thoughts can be converted to text. And so you can imagine the nefarious purposes to which that could be put. Physical torture, on the one hand, which is a good thing, will be able to end very soon. But what's going to replace it will be, I think, even more terrifying than what already exists today with physical torture. Many of you probably have heard of the chronic pain syndrome. This is when a person is feeling pain, let's say in a particular part of their body, but there's no external stimulus to cause that pain. And it's in essence, misfiring set of neurons in the person's brain. Now, the most extreme version of this is called complex regional pain syndrome, or CRPS. It's referred to as the suicide disease because 80% of the people who get it, who are experiencing the level of pain, the most intense level of pain a human can feel, because there are no treatments for it, end up committing suicide. We've already seen in laboratory settings brain-computer interfaces, implantable brain-computer interfaces that are showing great promise in addressing chronic pain syndrome and turning those neurons off. We're not there yet really when it comes to CRPS, but ultimately because we're already seeing success in the more mild form of the disease, it's really just a matter of time before that will happen. The problem is that once you've learned how to turn off the misfiring neurons, guess what? You can turn them on. And these are right now all implantable devices, but ultimately what can be done with an implantable device today with better brain-computer interfaces will ultimately be able to be undertaken and delivered with a wearable device, which means that in the not-too-distant future, and China, which is investing $1 billion a year through their military, could well already have a device like this or be in the process of accelerating its development. You're going to be able to, if you're, let's say, an authoritarian regime, strap a dissident in a chair, put on a wearable device, press a button and have them feel the most intense pain a person can feel. And as you can imagine, what that might be like for a dissident, I don't think anybody is going to want after that to be disobeying the dictator in those circumstances. And if in essence a dictatorship were to want to really mess up a person, you could leave them in a chair like that with that thing turned on for a day, a week, a month, or beyond. And I can only imagine the long-term physical and psychological impacts of that. The other nightmare scenario for neurotechnologies, which again is the flip side of something exciting happening, is the way in which BCIs have been able to disrupt impulses that mice have to various urges. And there already have been studies that have shown that if you implant a brain-computer interface in the part of the brain that lights up when a mouse that is obese sees highly caloric food and has a gorge impulse, you can actually stop that gorge impulse. The mouse won't eat the cheese and will just kind of ignore it, and then the mouse will lose weight. This exact experiment is now being done on humans right now. It's expected that it will work, that would be even better, as one can imagine, stapling a person's stomach or having them have to take, substantial medications, if one could do this in the right way. But the same gorge impulse disruption process could be used in a wide array of different ways, including, on the positive side, you might think it would be a good idea to disrupt the child sex offenders, for example, impulse to molest a child. But now imagine a chip designed to disrupt sexual urges to, quote, cure LGBT people, and parents imposing that, on children who have come to their parents and said that they're LGBT, and the parents being, either ultra-religious or having other terrible motivations to think that somehow there's something wrong with that. And what could happen from there would be very, very worrying. Another more near-term scenario is the use of these devices in the criminal justice system. So it's already been shown using the kernel flow device. If you look at a person who is telling the truth versus lying with one of these very high-resolution scanning devices like the kernel flow device, their brains look totally different when they're telling the truth versus lying. There has not been a software yet developed to do this systematically. It's only a matter of time before that happens. Ordinary lie detectors are beatable. These lie detectors will not be beatable. And that's, again, potentially both exciting when you think about exonerating a person who might not have committed a crime, but then imagine all the ways in which those technologies can be misused or abused. The other thing that we are talking about, this is more of a medium to longer term concern, is designer personalities. As I note here, a small percentage of people that undergo deep brain stimulation, they also have a major change in personality. And there's one well-known case of a woman who went from being an extreme introvert to being an extrovert with deep brain stimulation. So it stopped her Parkinson's syndromes, but changed her personality in ways in which her family didn't even recognize her. She likes her new personality, which is good for her. She'd been very introverted and now is extroverted, and that's now who she is. But it does raise the question as to, who is she? What is her identity as a human, right? Is it the natural, biological, normal state that she had where she was introverted? Or is it this new her where with the deep brain stimulation, she can become an extrovert? Because of the way in which it's functioned in this particular case, she's being intensively studied to try to understand how did the side effect happen, right? Because it was a side effect of another treatment for Parkinson's. But if you're able to decode, for example, where in the brain a person becomes an introvert or an extrovert and what the brain and the neural firing looks like in that part of the brain, then potentially you would be able to, in the future, and this is not a near-term issue, but change a person's personality. And who among us might not have certain personality traits we'd want to change? Now, whether I'd want an implantable brain-computer interface to change my personality, in my case, I don't think so. I'm not that desperate to change my personality, but one can imagine both the excitement that brings, but also how this also goes to the fundamental question of what does it actually mean to be human and how much of our traits are innate versus bendable and changeable. And then lastly, I mentioned before the driver of widening inequality. I talked about this one a little bit earlier, but we're going to be able to enhance human memory, as just that one illustration already shows with this first major study on short-term memory. And this is going to be both exciting and really, really compelling as well. So just briefly a little bit more about our foundation and what we're doing. We co-founded this foundation in 2021, and what we're trying to do is to really, on the one hand, promote innovation in the development of neurotechnologies and not slow their advance, but also protect human rights and ensure that they're developed ethically. And to do this, we engage in research, advocacy, and outreach. One of the questions that I'm also often asked is that a lot of these seem like future problems and not today problems. And so why is this an issue we need to be worrying about right now? And as I was mentioning earlier, invasive neurotechnologies, which require brain surgery, it's worth noting, are already strictly regulated as medical devices. And all of the data that is gathered from them are subject to health privacy laws, rules, and regulations. But consumer neurotech products that are non-invasive, even though they're using medical grade technologies, are subject right now to virtually no regulation at all. And as I was mentioning, we're talking about any one of these consumer products being able to, download from gigabytes to terabytes of neural data from a person. Now, this is an example of the 30 products. These are the 30 products that are on the market today. I would imagine that most of you have heard of maybe one or two of them at most, and maybe none of them at all. And so in that sense, we're not yet at a point where consumer neurotechnologies have really pierced the public imagination, but we are right on the cusp. And so Meta, Apple, and Snap are all developing consumer neurotechnology products right now. Meta acquired Control Labs, which is its neurotech arm, for about $1 billion. The founder and CEO of Control Labs, actually, as a former dissertation student of my colleague Rafael Yuste's at Columbia. And they're developing a wristband that can capture neural data from the wrist, translating a consumer intention into action. And so by that, what I mean is the following. It turns out that if you have a mouse, let's say, that you're gonna move with your hand, when you think about moving that mouse from one place to another place, even before you actually move it, there's a signal that is sent via your peripheral nervous system, from your central to your peripheral nervous system, that prepares your hand or fingers to move the mouse. Similarly, when you're looking to type on a keyboard, before you hit the button on the keyboard you're going to hit, there is a signal that is sent down there. And so it turns out that even from a person's wrist, for example, there are two things that this device is expected to be able to do. One is to move the mouse with your thoughts, and to be able to look at what your intended movements are of the mouse as you think about moving a mouse in your mind and being able to move it on the screen. And the other one is that ultimately you can also decode a person's thoughts from their wrist based on their intended typing on a virtual keyboard. So in other words, if a person is thinking about moving their fingers across the screen onto a keyboard, and I type out, Stanford, Stanford, and my hand is right here on the keyboard, and I don't move my hand, I'm just looking at the screen and thinking of those letters, you can actually decode from a person's wrist the letters they were going to type. So exciting, but when you look at Meta and its size, the moment that Meta makes a product like that and puts it on the market, you're talking about millions or tens of millions of people that will adopt that technology. Apple last year filed a patent for its next generation AirPod that will have built-in EEG sensors in it, right? Now think about how many people have AirPods. Now this is, you're not required when you file a patent application to say how you're going to use the technology that you are patenting. But the most logical first place would be to connect that to the Apple Watch that has a lot of health features in it, and to be able to do more in-depth health-related activities. But there's every reason to think that Apple is also working on thought-to-text translation from the kind of technology that's being developed, as I mentioned, in Australia. And once you hit over 90%, 90% accuracy in being able to decode thought-to-text from a wearable device, those EEG scanners in an AirPod would be a perfect way to collect that kind of neural data to be able to do it. And now you can imagine, and I think you heard it here first, so when you hear in a couple of years this is going to be rolled out, you can say, I remember that guy vaguely who spoke at Stanford for a long time with a lot of charts. And you're going to be able to do thought-to-text message translation. So imagine thinking with your thoughts, you want to open up a text message and then being able to dictate with your thoughts what you want in it and then being able to hit send, all without having to touch your phone. And I think that that's probably what Apple is thinking about. Again, once this new generation of AirPods comes on the market, think about how quickly those are going to proliferate. And then Snapchat, which owns Snap, acquired a neurotech company, and they have a bunch of virtual reality products. And so what they're doing is they're with their VR products, they're looking to build into it neurotech capabilities. So for example, if you are looking in a virtual world in front of you and you're choosing among, let's say, 20 different things, 20 different apps you can touch, you'll be able, with your thoughts, to be able to pick the one you want to touch and then press a button with your mind, thinking about pressing the button to, let's say, go to the next page there. So we actually just published, actually it was in April, not March, my apologies, a landmark study on consumer neurotechnology products. And what we did is we looked at the 30 publicly available products that are on the market and benchmarked their user agreements against global privacy standards to understand how are these companies actually treating your neural data today. Our study was actually covered on the front page of the New York Times just last month. And you can see here that the entry point for the article was a new law in Colorado that is extending privacy rights under their state privacy law to neural data. This is actually a law that we worked on very closely with the governor of Colorado and the state legislature in Colorado. And we were actually out there for the bill signing as we launched our report. And you can see that this is the description from the New York Times about our report and what we did. I'm going to now tell you a little bit more details about the report itself and what we found. But let's just say it's fair to conclude that there is a gigantic gap between global privacy standards and the way in which today consumer neurotech companies are actually treating your data. Let me tell you first a little bit about how we undertook this work in developing this report. First of all, we found these products online, and our goal was to say, to find every possible product we could find that you could buy online. So we looked at, all the different marketplaces where you could buy consumer electronics. We looked at Amazon. We just did web searches for neurotech, consumer product, or buy. And this is what we came up with, is these 30 products. What we then did is for each company and its product, we gathered all the relevant policy documents that we could from their website, privacy agreements, terms of sale, service, and use agreements. We also then attempted to contact each company up to 3 times, whatever means that they would be able to be contacted according to their website, to make sure that we had the most recent information and to give them the opportunity to share with us whatever they would like. And then we reviewed all these documents across 5 areas of concern. And this comes from global privacy standards in terms of these different categories, but access to information, data collection and data storage, data sharing, user rights, and data safety and security. And then what we did is, as I mentioned, benchmarked those, how these companies did in their policy documents against 6 different global sets of data practice standards. The first 3 are a binding law, as in you must abide by it if you're a company that sells these products within the jurisdiction. The European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, the African Union's Convention, and the California Consumer Privacy Act. And then we looked at 3 other, because they're from different regions of the world, soft law frameworks, which are guidance to governments and to companies in those parts of the world. So I'm now going to just very briefly walk through what is about a 100-page report in about no more than 5 or 10 minutes to give you just some of the key highlights. And you can see that there are enormous gaps between what you would expect and hope for and what the practices actually are. So it turns out that, for example, a quarter of the companies don't even have privacy practices that they're really talking about. And if you look at all the companies we reached out to, almost 2/3 of them didn't even reply to multiple attempts to reach them. So I mean, one of the first things you need to know if about any kind of consumer product you were going to buy is, can I ask questions about what I'm giving up if I buy your product? And the fact that 2/3 of them didn't even respond to 3 requests to ask them if we had the right information was not a very positive sign. We also looked at the documents themselves to see if they would tell us, if it said specifically in those agreements, if there's a change to their policies, would you be affirmatively told? And only 1/3 of them, it was clear the answer was yes. Half were unclear, and a few actually, it was clearly not the case that you would be updated. Now let's look at data collection and storage. Again, even though these are all consumer neurotech products and they're all gathering neural data with brain-computer interfaces, more than half of them didn't even mention the word neural data in the agreements that you're signing. So how are you supposed to even know that your neural data is being gathered, let alone the sensitivity of it, if you're not even told? One of the other principles that is built into global privacy frameworks is the idea of data minimization, which is that any consumer product that gathers data of any kind, whether it be your credit card or your brain data, only the amount of data that is actually needed to perform the service for that particular product is what should be gathered. Now, it's much more difficult in the context of neural data because you can't actually identify within a person's brain scan the data that you need for a narrow purpose until you actually have the full scan. So you can't just kind of narrowly scan one part of their brain or one piece of their brain activity. You have to do the full scan, let's say on the EEG scanner, and then from there you can decode it and go after the specific data within that broader scan. But again, almost none of the companies mentioned anything about data minimization, and yet it turns out that you need less than 1% of the downloaded data to serve the purposes of any of these particular devices, which means 99% of the data that they are having and keeping, for the most part, as you'll see in a moment, is data that they don't actually need to provide the service that they're giving to you. One of the other key questions is also about data retention periods. While a little more than, about 2/3 of them did define data retention periods, they were generally very long. So in a number of cases, it was like, we'll keep your data for 10 years. And in other cases, it was, in some cases, it was as long as we would like, and so forth. Now, why does that matter? Why that matters is because what can be done today with these products in terms of the decoding of brain data is more limited. Today, for example, with an EEG scanner, you could, if any of these companies were buying medical grade software, they could run that against your EEG scan and know if you had any of a number of different brain diseases. But for example, we cannot yet decode from the EEG scanner what's being done in Australia in terms of what your thoughts were when you were wearing the device. But if they keep the data for 10 years, there's no question that within a few years, we're going to have this kind of software available that with generative AI will be able to decode that person's brain scan from today. And anything the person might have been thinking at the time they were wearing the device, even though you can't today decode that, will be decodable in the future. And so having long data retention periods means lots of new developments in neurotech could be applied to your brain scan that you may not want. So now let's look at data sharing. 2/3 of the companies say that they can share your data with third parties. A third of them are about unclear. Only one of the 30 companies said they will not share your data, and it's the one company that keeps your data only on the local device, and it doesn't access your data, and it processes it on that local device. And that's really the only one of the 30 products you can say your brain data is safe and secure. And you can see here that in terms of selling data to third parties, 80% of the user agreements were unclear as to whether they could do it. 2 companies said, yes, we can, and a few more said, no, we can't. But most of them were unclear. If it's unclear, it means they can sell your data. I mean, if they're saying we won't sell your data or we will sell your data, that's obviously quite clear. But if it's unclear, there's nothing that prohibits them from selling your data. Then there's the question about user rights. Now, typically 2 of the key rights in these data protection hard and soft law standards that are very, very important is, can you tell the company to stop processing your data? And can you request that the company delete your data? And you can see here, what the numbers are. There were only 12 companies that both allowed users to withdraw consent and also to ask for their data to be deleted. But this number is actually very deceiving, because given that only one company keeps the data locally, the reality is, because virtually all of these companies have the ability to transfer your data to a third party, nothing would stop any of these companies from creating a sister company that the moment your data has been downloaded, that second, your data gets offloaded to that third company owned by technically different people. And so by the time you might go to tell them to withdraw consent or delete your data, it's a meaningless promise in the user agreement, because your data was long gone. So in fact, that 40% really is an illusion, and is not. And the answer is really that none of the companies actually allow that, because given that they do allow the ability to transfer your data, your data could be long gone, and asking them to delete it from this particular company won't mean that your data hasn't already left that company and gone to another one. And then lastly, on questions of data safety and security, We looked up issues like de-identifying the data. Again, hard to do with neural data, as I was just mentioning, because what can be decoded today is going to be a lot less than what can be decoded in the future. 80% of the companies said nothing about how your data, or whether your data would even be encrypted, which again is obviously of serious concern. And more than 80% of the companies, for example, didn't specifically say that they would notify you if there was a security breach. So again, these are obviously very, very worrying. And so what you could see in terms of a conclusion of our report is that consumers, overwhelmingly lack access to information, which is totally inconsistent with the principles of transparency and access that international standards require. You also, when you think about notice and consent, this lack of information obviously undermines the idea of notice and consent, because how can you consent to something when it hasn't been explained to you? Obviously you can't. And all the companies exercise significant control over the collection, storage, retention, and repurposing of neural data. And this raises enormous concerns given the sensitivity of the neural data. For example, today, any one of these companies, except for the one that I mentioned that keeps the data locally, they could already have purchased medical grade software that enables them to know if you have any of a number of different brain diseases that can be diagnosed by an EEG. And they could be selling it to insurance carriers right now, saying, we have this user, this is their name, this is their address, and we've been able to tell from a brain scan we did for a different purpose that they have epilepsy. And that could be already today being sold to insurance companies. So as I bring my presentation to a conclusion, let's talk about what can be done to address these kinds of issues and concerns. There's a lot being done by multilateral organizations at the national level and by local governments to report on, develop laws, or issue declarations. You can see here a bunch of different examples. We're really, though, at the beginning stages of this. So, for example, at the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution on neurotechnologies and human rights. They commissioned their advisory committee to the Human Rights Council to do a report on the implications of neurotechnologies on human rights and how different parts of the UN human rights system might engage. Again, a productive first step forward, but a far cry from ultimately what needs to be done. Ultimately, one of the most important things we need to do is to look to extend the interpretation of existing international human rights laws. So, for example, there's a treaty called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that's been signed and ratified by about 175 countries in the world, covering about 90% of the world's population. Under Article 17 of that treaty, which is binding on all states that have signed and ratified it, there's a right of privacy under international law. And the treaty itself was was written in the 60s and adopted in the 70s and came into force in the 70s. And that provision, Article 17, was last interpreted by the UN body that interprets the treaty itself, called the Human Rights Committee, in the mid-1980s. And the definition under international law of the right to privacy talks about a right to be free from arbitrary interference with your privacy. But when you look at that kind of an interpretation, it doesn't necessarily consider the possibility that someone could, for example, passively gather information about your brain data, which wouldn't necessarily interfere with your privacy as much as it would just simply access information about you. And so one of the things, of course, the people who drafted that treaty in the 1960s, if they'd known of the idea that your mental privacy might be at risk, they would have wanted to protect the contents of your brain from being accessed by anybody without your explicit and specific consent. And so what we really need to do, for example, is that treaty body that I mentioned, the Human Rights Committee, needs to reconsider the interpretation of what does the right of privacy mean in the 21st century, and further interpret that provision to include a right of mental privacy and to embed it within the treaty, and as a matter of interpretation of Article 17. Once that were to happen, and that can happen within a few years, typically to develop a new general comment or amend an old one, then every country that is a party to the treaty, the 175 countries, would be obligated at a national level to protect mental privacy. And it would then take time, of course, between that interpretation to then get countries around the world to actually follow through on what they're obligated to do under international law. But this is one way in which international human rights law can be used to advance protections for the misuse and abuse of neurotechnologies. At the national level, Chile is the only country in the world that has done something pretty unique. On this issue, they actually created a new constitutional amendment on a right of mental privacy. And in fact, in a first ever Supreme Court case in Chile last year, they found one of the 30 companies I was mentioning to have violated a person from Chile's mental privacy because of the nature of how that user agreement was actually written, which of course interferes with their mental privacy without telling them that in fact they are doing so. Colorado is the first state in the country to extend neural privacy rights protections to neural data. There are 15 states in the U.S. that have state-level privacy laws, and California is actually on the cusp with Senator Becker here, who actually represents Silicon Valley, the state senator, Josh Becker. We've gotten through the committee in California an amendment to the California Consumer Protection Act that will extend it to protect neural data, and that is actually going to go to the floor of the state Senate next week. We expect that to be adopted in the state Senate and then go to the House, the state legislature over the summer. And hopefully by the fall, we're talking about having these kinds of protections in place in California. But a lot more work ultimately needs to be done. I was just mentioning the international work. In an article that I published a couple of years back now, I'm not going to walk through all this, but it identified a lot of other things that the UN system could possibly do, and we're requiring leadership, a mix of leadership, institutional architecture, and strategies to try to kind of extend outward awareness raising on these questions. And finally, I'll just conclude, given we are here in Silicon Valley, with kind of the role of companies and their investors. Obviously industry has an important role to play here and could even reduce the need for further regulation if companies and investors came together and developed a code of conduct for the responsible development of neurotechnologies. And by adopting that kind of a code, individual companies could, along with investors, signal to consumers that they actually are going to develop products that will actually protect their users' mental privacy and safeguard their neural data. We've also, along with a number of other experts, proposed the idea of a technocratic oath, like the Hippocratic Oath for medicine, that could be taken on by those who are in the field of developing neurotechnologies and to pledge to adhere to ethical principles of the kinds that we identified below. With that, I've undoubtedly thrown a lot at you to think about and gone through a whole lot of slides in a, relatively short period of time, but very much look forward to your questions. If you want a copy of the presentation, just email me and I'll be more than happy to share it with you as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was fascinating, exciting, and terrifying all at the same time. I guess that's true of a lot of new technologies. We are now talking about AI's capacity in both exciting and terrifying ways. And a lot of people who talk about that link that issue to the era of nuclear weapons. When the nuclear weapons emerged, that was also a scary prospect. So I'm wondering, I'm going to open up for questions very quickly, but I just want to throw a couple of questions at you before that. One is, I'd like to get a better sense of the potential threat of this technology. So AI, a lot of people are concerned because we kind of don't know what's going on in the black box, and we don't seem to have control over what's going on. And AI gaining autonomy and doing whatever it wants, and we humans losing control over it. That's the scary probably the scariest prospect. So is there anything in these neurotechnologies that is similar to that, or is neurotechnology more closer to something like nuclear weapons, where it could do terrible things, but humans generally have control over that technology? How do you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question to answer. I think because AI can be deployed in so many different thematic areas of work all around the world, it's harder to get your arms around, like, what is it and how could it be deployed? And I think that creates an enormous sense of anxiety because we're limited by the power of our own imagination. I think that we know on the upside what neurotechnologies ultimately will hopefully be able to do. Today, for example, there are no cures for any brain diseases. All you can do is, at best, slow their acceleration. And and obviously you can't reverse the effects of any brain diseases either. So Neurotechnologies provides the promise to help understand our own brains. And for example, if you ask a neuroscientist today, how do you explain a human thought in medical and neurological terms? We don't have an answer to that question yet. Neurotechnologies are going to enable us to answer that question. Ultimately, it's going to enable us to be able to cure brain diseases. This is according to my close colleague, Raphael Yuste. We're going to see cures for brain diseases in our lifetime. And we're also very likely going to be able to see certain brain diseases that their effects could be even reversed. So the upside potential for humanity, especially when you're talking about 1 in 3 people that will have a neurological disease, is off the charts, extraordinary. And when you think about, the example of the woman who had been locked in for 18 years, Ann Johnson, from that New York Times story, and how her life has been transformed by the technology, and that's just one person in one place, right? The upside is enormous. I think the downside risk is also very large, and I think it's, the hope is that by developing global standards on this and developing national legal and regulatory environments, in many to most cases in the world, we're going to have a lot of transparency into the technologies that are being developed and their dual use, both for good or for bad. And society is going to be able to focus on and engage with these questions and debate, how are these technologies that can do great things also going to be deployed in bad ways, and how should that be controlled? I think the black box piece of this, of course, is countries that have more nefarious motives for developing neurotechnologies that can be misused or abused to achieve more nefarious ends. And as is already the case, I think, in those contexts, it will continue to be very difficult to penetrate and see what's being developed or how it is being misused or abused. But I do think that one can wrap one's arms around both the enormous upside potential as well as the risks with neurotechnologies much more clearly than at least I know I can when it comes to artificial intelligence.
So that is leads to my second question, the establishing some guardrails against nefarious uses by dictators and nefarious governments.
Yeah.
And it sounds like what you talked about and what the laws passed in Colorado and California, these are focused on data use, right? Neural data use, and it seems like that's here and now kind of threat, and that's why you're addressing them, and that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. But in the future, to prevent those nefarious uses of this technology, it seems to me like some kind of nuclear non-proliferation type of treaty, international agreement is needed in order to prevent those types of use. So is that a next step for you and the international community concerned about these issues?
Yeah, I mean, although I put up that slide very quickly, in the slide in the UN, one of the things that was mentioned there was the possibility of a new UN agency to look at these issues. But my guess is that that's more like a 10-year time horizon. Yeah. I do think in the long run, you're right that, as these technologies become much more widely available, there'll be a much greater sense of urgency to control the potential worst misuse and abuse scenarios. And so I think that the idea of an international treaty around this would make sense. But I think we're far from that right now because we're really just at the beginning stages of this. As I've traveled the world along with my colleague and appeared at the UN with regional organizations, NGOs, governments around the world, not surprisingly, there are very few people that know much at all about what's happening with neurotechnologies and where it's heading and what can be done and the risks of misuse and abuse. So we have an enormous way to go in terms of global public education and awareness raising. I think that in the same way that ChatGPT transformed the global public's view of AI in a single instant when it was released, we are on the cusp of that awareness that really needs to be there. Up until now, it's been much harder to get the UN and others to start thinking about this as a today problem when the reality is that people's views of neurotechnologies are primarily based on kind of dystopian views coming from Hollywood over many decades of how this technology could advance. But when you actually sit down and start talking to officials at the UN or with the US government, people who are not aware of these kinds of technologies, often people's first reaction is like, I know these things are being developed, but surely this can't be a today problem. And I think that our hope is that the report that we just did on consumer devices demonstrates that it is a today problem. I also think equally that we're, for example, talking to a number of the big tech companies and have offered pro bono to help them, for example, with their user agreements that they're going to have. And if one of the major tech companies that I was mentioning, Meta, Apple, or Snap, as they launch their consumer neurotech devices, if they have user agreements that are consistent with global standards, and I think that they ultimately will need to be, and I hope and expect they would be, then that would also go a long way to creating a global standard about how consumer neural data would be used, and treated. But we're really just not there yet when it comes to, thinking globally about the kind of longer-term misuse in much more nefarious ways of this technology, because we're not even yet grappling effectively with existing uses when it comes to consumer neural data.
Wonderful. Great, thank you. So now I'd like to open the floor for questions. There are a couple here and there.
Hi.
Hi.
Very nice to meet you. Thank you for coming to speak. I've learned a lot today. I wanted to ask you more about, you said that the invasive tech right now is pretty strictly regulated for medical use. And I'm very curious about kind of the boundaries of that medical use, especially in terms of physical versus mental medicine, and to what extent users and doctors and other people have agency to kind of argue that they should or should not qualify for a medical use of these invasive devices.
So it's a good question. I wouldn't say I'm an expert on this. I'm obviously not a medical doctor, I don't have a PhD either. But I could just say from a lot of the conversations I've been involved with, in general, we're not especially concerned about the medical uses because everything is just so heavily regulated across the board. I think that the two kinds of devices that I focused on up front in terms of deep brain stimulation and cochlear implants, those have been around for decades and have been used in 100,000 plus people around the world. So that's very well-trodden territory in terms of both how it works and the different kinds of diseases it can help treat and how. And of course, all the data that's being gathered there, is heavily protected as medical data. Similarly, of course, for the woman Ann Johnson who had that implant that led to her now being able to communicate thought to text is also covered as medical data. It's all done in a medical context as well. I do think that there are going to be a lot of questions that will be raised by neurotech, but we haven't really yet gotten to them about mental versus physical diseases and what is appropriate or not appropriate to address through invasive neurotechnologies. As of yet, I think when you look at mental health care and medical devices, obviously for people with severe depression, there are electrical stimulation treatments that have been, again, done over many, many decades that can kind of help reset a person with severe depression and assist them in the most extreme cases of people with severe depression. I'm sure, though, as one begins to understand the brain more effectively and all the different kinds of diseases that come from the brain, neurological and non-neurological, there will be additional uses. You can also see, even just with the wearable devices, that a lot of them that kind of fall within the wellness category are intended, for example, to help with everything from sleep to depression, et cetera. And so you're kind of already starting to see neurotech kind of get into mental health related issues. But we're really just at the beginning stages of all this, so it's not quite clear where it's all going to head. But I think that there will be lots of important ethical questions that need to be considered by people developing these technologies, and also, in both medical and non-medical contexts, discussing what kinds of things people should be dealing with necessarily themselves versus trying to secure help and support through technology.
Well, thank you for the presentation, such a diverse and comprehensive view. I think part of the story of the neurotech is that for those devices to actually work, you need to collect data and data flows very aggressively. So we see a combination of telemetry data, biometric data, and very complicated management of those data flows. Need to be stored, transferred, sometimes offloaded to the cloud, combined to make inferences, and maybe reused for further uses. I think some of the discussions floating out there right now is that people see may see the lacking of the capability of the binary opt-in, opt-out choice in terms of protecting privacy for the consumers and users. For example, the firms might want to revisit those data in the future, coupled with the capability of artificial intelligence to customize a better experience for the consumers. And we might also want that. So from a policy standpoint, as a lawyer, do you think conventional legal tools are enough to address those novel challenges from neurotech, or do we have to reimagine new ways to deal with those challenges?
It's a great question. And I don't begrudge any startup that wants as much data as it can collect that it can monetize and sell. I mean, that's, for example, in the DNA testing field, there are now 4 major DNA testing companies that have collected more than 40 million samples of people's DNA, including my own in one context, who used 23andMe to learn more about my own DNA. And undoubtedly, I signed away in a way that de-identified my own DNA that is being used for who knows what purpose, as part of that. I think the key thing for me is about, users being aware of what it is they're giving away, and whether or how it can be de-identified. And I think one of the challenges that you have with neural data that you don't have with DNA or with biometric data like an iris scan or a fingerprint is that, if you give away your fingerprint to the US government, let's say, as I think I did to become part of Global Entry, for example, I know that the US government has my fingerprint. I know it could be used in a federal database search if I were to commit a crime. I can imagine all the ways in which my fingerprint could be used or misused by the US government, and I decided to trade that for the ability to get through security at international airports much more quickly. The problem is with neural data and how much is in it that we don't understand. Today, we can only decode about 1% of what is in a brain scan. That's expected to rise to 3 or 4% in, let's say, the coming 5 years. But everything of who we are, our memories, our emotions, our drive, our motivation, our personalities, our relationships to the world, our relationships with other people, all of that is within our brain and within the neural data that can be captured from our brain. And ultimately, for example, my colleague Rafael Yuste says you're going to be able to decode a person's subconscious thoughts. Today, we can only decode a person's active thoughts in the form of words, right? But eventually, you're going to be able to understand your own subconscious by decoding your brain scan. And so I don't think anybody has any idea, really, unless you're like a neuroscientist or medical doctor, and you can begin to imagine when you're giving away gigabytes to terabytes of your neural data, what is actually in there. And it's not clear, for example, if you have that and you disconnect that from a person's personal identity, i.e., these neurotech devices, when you upload your EEG scan to their cloud, it's connected to your own name, address, et cetera, so that they can decode that part of the data they need to give you the service that they're providing and give it right back to you and not to give it to someone else, right? So there's a direct connect there. But even if you sever the connection to your name, address, et cetera, we don't know, actually right now, how individualized that data is going to be able to be decoded and whether it can be still connected back to you in the future. And I think that that's one of the unique problems that you have with neural data that you might not have with other forms of data that exist today. It is undoubtedly true that a person's brain scan is like a fingerprint and could be used like a fingerprint in the future. But because there are no accessible databases of brain scans, and the number of brain scans that have been done globally is not enormous, it can't yet be used for that purpose. But one day it will be able to be used in that same way. But if you look at how, for example, just one of the 30 devices I was mentioning, which is the Muse device, which, among other purposes, exists to help. It can help you determine if you're in a meditative state, and so you can put the device on, wear it for an hour, meditate, and then look at your app, and it will tell you when were you in a meditative state over that hour. They talk about publicly that they've already downloaded 100 million hours worth of neural data of consumers. So, I mean, each hour of a brain scan is terabytes of data. Multiply that by 100 million, and you have a sense of the volume of data that's being captured just by one company. And that company has, I think, 300,000 or 400,000 users, which is very small when you compare it to, let's say, if Meta rolls out its device or Apple its device. So I think you raise a very important question also around, are there new models for thinking through beyond kind of yes or no consent? Our foundation doesn't oppose any user voluntarily giving away their brain scan to whoever they want, whenever they want, and however they want. We just think that users need to be informed properly of what it is that they're giving away, and it shouldn't be a default opt-in. Although I understand why, if I were a founder of a neurotech company, I would want it to be a default opt-in. So I think that these are all, I think ultimately these kinds of questions need to be discussed in the public at large, and this is why I think the California Consumer Privacy Act amendments that are forthcoming is going to provide an opportunity, at least in California, where 80% of the neurotech is being developed in the world today, 80 to 90%, will provide a good opportunity to begin to have those kinds of discussions. Because again, we don't want to slow down the development of the advancement of neurotech, but at the same time, we have to engage in a dialogue process with those who are developing the technologies and the investors and consumer groups, right, to find that balance point where sufficient data is gathered to be able to support medical developments, while at the same time also making sure that people are not involuntarily or without their understanding handing away large volumes of their neural data that could be used against them in a wide array of ways. And I would imagine insurance companies would love to know what brain disease I might get in the future, which might already be able to be decoded from a brain scan. So I think we have to just be very, very careful about that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You're really showing us how nuanced this topic is. And the question I had was related to maybe towards the end of your presentation. You said you were doing some work, or you had published something that relates to policies that the UN could work with. So I have two questions that relate to that. First of all, as amazing as these technologies are, where does that leave developing countries who are so far removed from these technologies? I can think of a very dystopian scenario. Secondly, are there any safeguards in place that would prevent these technologies from being used for warfare? So again, this takes me into a dystopian futuristic scenario. So I'm just really curious about that, especially with regards to the national global entities that are in place to protect us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think on the first point, this is why a right to fair access to mental augmentation is one of the 5 neuro rights that we're trying to advance. I'm very, very concerned as a human rights lawyer about the enormous disconnect between have and have-nots in technology more broadly. And I think in this case, because of the power of these specific kinds of technologies as compared to other technologies that are more or less able to be quantified, one can see immediately when you talk about, for example, the ability to enhance short-term memory, which has now already been done with a group of senior citizens by Boston University, the dramatic impact on our own lives every single day and how it could be impacted by this technology in a way that I can't think of much other technology. I mean, lots of technologies help us. Having a phone helps us communicate more effectively, and having word processing software and having all these ways that we can be interconnected helps. But I mean, being able to remember things more clearly than other people is a huge and enormous differentiator in all aspects of one's academic and professional life. So I think, I think this, while this is not an immediate problem, it will become one very quickly, and it's one that we need to be talking about already right now, which is why we have just begun talking about it. And I think when it comes to those kinds of devices, the expectation is when it comes to, for example, the technologies that are being used by Boston University, these are not expensive or difficult technologies to develop or to apply. They may actually be relatively inexpensive, but still there will be an enormous gap between have and have-nots. And so I think we need to be figuring out, and developing within the framework of the existing international human rights system. You have a right, there are lots of different, there's a right to development, there's a right to education, there are rights to access to healthcare, right, all embedded already in international law and different treaties. And I think that access to neurotechnologies will need to be, again, further interpreted into those existing rights, and then ultimately resources are going to have to be invested so that as much of humanity as possible can benefit as much as humanity as possible can benefit from these things. So I think that that's definitely a problem. When it comes to a problem that needs to be addressed and thought about a lot, when it comes to nefarious uses of these technologies, I think we, again, are just on the cutting edge of this. I think, I am very worried to see China investing $1 billion a year through the military. But frankly, I'm also concerned about the US government putting money through DARPA into investing in neurotech. Our best distant understanding of what DARPA is doing is it's really more about creating super soldiers and almost sort of, I know one set of the technologies that they're looking at is, for example, could there be a BCI that a soldier could wear in the field that in essence, for example, could project even into their visual cortex of like views of the battlefield and these kinds of things. Almost like, if you think about the movie Terminator and the view through the eyes of the Terminator where it sees threats coming and these kinds of things. I mean, that sounds obviously very dystopian, futuristic, but also very plausible ultimately. I mean, the expectation is, for example, that there will be a cure for blindness for people who would want that. It's already the case that you can decode what's coming from the from the eyes to the visual cortex and put it on a TV screen, and it's black and white and grainy, but it comes in and out of visual resolution, and you can tell in essence shapes and images. Ultimately, that's going to be able to be substantially improved. And for a person whose eyes don't work, you're actually going to be able to take images from a TV camera and pump it into their visual cortex. So what DARPA might do potentially in this field would potentially work with a wearable device, for example. In terms of other uses for it in warfare, I'm probably limited by the power of my imagination as a human rights lawyer and not as an expert in warfare. But undoubtedly, these devices are going to help enormously in lots of very positive ways and can obviously be misused or abused in a wide array of ways also. I mean, right now, we're still not at the point where you have, for example, a wearable device that can decode human thought with more than 90% accuracy. But once you have that with a wearable device, I mean, theoretically, you could have a device from a distance that could scan a person's brain and be able to decode their thoughts in real time. Again, that sounds, very futuristic and dystopian. But again, every time you get past one hurdle and the advancing of the technologies, then the question is, what's the next hurdle? And so I think all of these things would be potentially possible, and I think there are lots of very worrying scenarios there. But I think we have to start with the here and now, where we're clearly not doing enough, and where I think we can explain to people quite clearly, here's what the neurotech is that's available and how consumer rights are not being respected. And as I said, even though we're talking about a global market by 2027 of $4 billion, when either Apple or Meta or Snap go global with their products, any time one major tech company is going to advance something like this, you're talking about tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world adopting that technology, and people's awareness of the upside and the downside is going to be transformed, almost with a snap of the fingers. So that's both. I think we know that's coming, and the question is, what are we doing now to put in place the kind of guardrails that are necessary so that when that comes, the world will be able to also know at the same time that people have been already giving a lot of thought to misuse and abuse and are working intensely on those questions, while at the same time, people ultimately should be able to use these devices for the purposes for which they're designed in ways that they feel safe and secure.
Hi. I was just wanting to ask, have you thought about how to go about showing the companies that are involved with this nanotechnology maybe a possibility of what they could do that's positive? I understand it would be very ill-advised to try to curtail them or give them a list of priorities, but I myself am a prison abolitionist, but I believe it would be a waste for this life-changing technology to be used to correct behaviors such as desires to assault children rather than grant people the voices that they deserve. Because some things that are happening, such as assault, would be more so things that people need to incur the punishment for. And while I don't believe that prison is the right way to do that, I don't believe that it would really be the best use of the technology for it to just be able to take away those thoughts, because that's not really fair to the victims either. And I know that brings in a lot of ethical questions, but my main question to you is, have you guys thought of a way to kind of describe some major things that could be done first with the technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the latter point, as a human rights lawyer, I fully understand that there would be a very big set of disagreements on the question of, for example, child pedophiles between civil libertarians and victims' rights advocates, and that reasonable people could have very differing views. My own view of how that kind of a technology, if available, could be used, would not be that it would be compulsory, but that, for example, if a person wants, for example, to get out of prison early, they could volunteer to have that kind of technology used as a way to ensure that there are greater protections, for example, available. So it would be used as a carrot, not as a stick. And I think people should have a right to have a carrot to make their lives easier and better. And they would have to decide for themselves whether or not they would want to go down that road. Look, I do think that these are all very difficult questions, to wrestle with, and I think we are just at the beginning of having these kinds of conversations. So I think, in the near term, there will be a lot of much more rudimentary uses of this technology, which will make our lives easier. I've gotten pretty good at kind of dictating notes that are not well transcribed by my current electronic devices, but I would love to be able, for example, to do word processing using my thoughts rather than typing on a screen. I mean, I type pretty fast and pretty accurately, but it'd be kind of nice to be able to do that. I think there are a lot of health-related applications that people will really appreciate coming from this technology as well. So I think the idea is that hopefully people will be first excited about the positive uses of this before being scared about the negative uses of this. And I think we have to, again, we don't, myself and our foundation, we don't want to curtail the development of the technology, but at the same time, we have to be realistic about, there are a lot of dual use applications of the technology itself. So we have to be prepared for that. And we're going to see one way or another this technology being misused or abused. And I think once we see a very high profile example of that, we'll kind of know it when we see it, and people will realize what we have to do. But the reality is that authoritarian regimes around the world, for example, are already engaging in lots of bad conduct that we don't see. So this is just a different form of bad conduct, which could be particularly invasive in light of the idea of being able, for example, to decode a person's thoughts against their will and these kinds of things. But I think we have to take the bad with the good. I think in the long run, the positive impacts of neurotechnologies will dramatically outweigh the downside risks. But we have to be working to both support the first set of uses and try to minimize the risk of all the negative potential consequences.
We'll take last two questions together and then ask you to answer them.
So I'm kind of thinking about, there's already a framework for regulating medical data that's clearly medical, and it was sort of born in the medical field. But I think in some ways, biological data, the train has already left the station for biological data belonging out in the private sector in a non-medical context. Like 23andMe, for example, is a private company where it's the vast majority of genome sequencing is still done in medical research that's bound by HIPAA regulations. And HIPAA is definitely not perfect, but it is a pretty aggressive framework. We're from the medical school, so we bump up against HIPAA every time we want to use a flash drive. So would it not be something you could at least put on the brainstorming map of making some kind of decision that brain data is biological data and just for now needs to be regulated within an existing aggressive framework like HIPAA, for example?
Thank you. I had a question looking at what you alluded to previously within the children's rights framework. So in particular, you were talking about potential conversion therapy uses of these neurotechnologies. And I know that we have ongoing debates about children's access to tech writ large, privacy about children, and then also parental oversight of children's privacy. And so I'm wondering, within this framework, we talked a lot about the impact on adults, but what is also the conversation right now on children's rights, both from the harvesting of their data by these tech companies, but then also the use of these neurotechnologies by their parents on children specifically?
Yeah. So I'll take each of these in turn. So the medical model is definitely one way forward. There's no question about it. Although so far no regulator has kind of gone down that road yet, we're still at the very early stages. In the UK, their data privacy regulator mentioned the medical model as one way to potentially regulate neural data. The problem is that when it comes to at least, let's say, a US context, when you're talking about healthcare-related data under HIPAA, and you're talking about the FDA regulating medical devices, there are very clear definitions of what a medical device is and what it means to be a medical device. And if you start to pull in under that, in essence what you'd be doing is starting by pulling in under that all of the consumer neurotech products that were in the wellness category. Yeah. I think politically it'd be very, very difficult to think about how that could actually move forward in light of the fact that you in essence would need to amend the definitions of a medical device under the FDA to include neurotech wellness devices. And I think that would be very, very difficult in light of the enormous political challenges that would face. We've actually had a hard time even in the United States creating a national consumer data privacy law at the federal level. At the federal level, while there are 15 states that have state privacy laws, at the federal level, the only data we protect are healthcare data under HIPAA and financial data. There's now a bipartisan bill in the Congress that is being advanced by the chairs of the Senate and the House Commerce Committees, respectively, Senator Cantwell and Congresswoman McMorris-Rogers, which would take about 25 different areas of consumer data and provide further protections for them, going down to even, for example, the contents of your date book would be protected data. Interestingly, right now, and we're talking to both their offices about it, neural data is not protected. Yeah. And they thought that neural data, both of them and their staff seem to think that neural data could be included under the term biometric data, but neural data is not biometric as a matter of medicine and science, which you know better than me, but my colleague, Rafael Yuste, is my guide on those questions. So I do think that clearly the medical model is one way to go, and I think in these conversations on Capitol Hill will definitely be lots of ideas thrown around. I mean, we're going to be going to Washington in a couple of weeks and meeting at the FDA and meeting with lots of different people to talk about this and how to deal with it. I think there'll be a lot of pushback from investors and companies that are in the wellness space about, if you make all wellness products protected under HIPAA, then how does that play out with the FDA? How does it play out more generally?
Sorry, but do they people can use wellness as a term to maybe sidestep?
Agreed.
Regulation that actually they probably should be considered.
Agreed.
Prescription.
No, and if there be one place to try to do that, it might be here because you're talking about medical grade EEGs, and if you use the very same EEGs in a lab, then it would be a medical device that had to be, approved by the FDA, and it's the same quality equipment. So I definitely take your point, and my colleague, Dr. Yuste, who's a medical doctor as well as a PhD, I think would be a fan of that kind of an approach. The question is politically what's possible. On the question of children's rights and potential misuse and abuse of neurotechnologies, other than the example that I've just given, because it's a nightmare scenario, I think nobody's given any thought yet at all to the use of the use or misuse of consumer neurotechnologies with children, because the devices themselves are just so nascent. There are 30 of these products that I talked about. Some of them relate to playing games, which theoretically a child could use today. Most of them would be of no interest to children. When you're talking about like monitoring your sleep and decoding your sleep patterns, et cetera, although parents obviously could be applying those devices to kids. But I do think that there was a very dramatic misuse and abuse of neurotech in China relating to children that took place. That definitely attracted some attention. It was a couple of years ago, and it was with one of these devices, actually. A company called BrainCo had a device that monitors concentration, and if you're concentrating, then the device will tell you that. And if you're not focused and not concentrating, it will tell you that. And they basically took this device in China and put it on 30 kids in a classroom on headbands that would be green when the child was concentrating and red when the child was not concentrating. And you can find this online if you look up Brain Code China, Neurotech. There's a 5-minute video done by a news organization that kind of shows this in action. And then like the parents were being shared like the ranking list of children in the classroom and who was concentrating the most in any given day. That caused a huge uproar even in China, and ultimately that was discontinued. But it gives you a sense of the world that we are entering and how this kind of technology could be deployed. And that kind of a device in a different kind of context wouldn't necessarily be the worst thing in the world. If, for example, you're trying to diagnose a person, and I'm just speaking theoretically, but like someone with ADHD, and I don't know what studies that might have been done with a concentration device and a neurotech device, but presumably there's some brain data you could gather from a device that measures your concentration that would look at, what percentage of the time are you concentrating in school to evaluate, for example, whether or not you have ADHD, but not in a way that makes public to the world and to someone other than a doctor and the parents, that kind of data. So I could imagine a theoretical way in which this device could have been deployed in some constructive manner, but obviously the way that it was deployed shocked people even in China and got discontinued quite quickly. But there are already employers that are, we're talking about, our study is on consumer neurotech devices, but there's a whole world of neurotech devices that are being deployed in the workplace. And I didn't really touch on it all because this isn't really what we focus on, workplace specific ones. But one use that's being done in long haul trucking is a device that monitors your sleep, your level of alertness and awareness, and whether you're starting to broadcast signals that suggest you're drowsy, and then an alarm goes off on the device, if you're starting to be drowsy. I think that's very much in the interest of employers and truck drivers to know when the truck driver is actually drowsy and to do something about it. But you could also see that device being used against the truck driver who didn't stop, for example, when the device was telling them this. And you could also say, well, if you're a truck driver, what if you object to having to wear a device that in real time is transmitting your levels of alertness to to people? The same kind of device has also been deployed in Chinese factories for people who work on the line making equipment, like having to do the same repetitive motion stuff. And there have been examples, again, in China of where this kind of alertness and concentration level devices have been used as a basis to fire people from their jobs if they're not consistently productive and concentrating. So we are entering a brave new world when it comes to this. Again, my focus has been on consumer products that are going to be widely available, but there is a whole swath of developing workplace-specific neurotech products. And I don't know that any of us would want in our workplace, whatever we do for a living, our employer actually knowing how much of the time were we concentrating versus dozing off or being distracted in some way or another.
Interesting to implement that in my classroom if I had access to that device.
You could be the first in the United States, Theo. You might be the last also, but...
That's true. That's true. But anyway.
But if the students agreed, up front.
Well, they would have to sign.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, sorry we went over time, but it was so fascinating and fantastic. Please join me in thanking Jared Genser for the wonderful talk.
Thank you.